welcome to what I think will be an engaging and certainly relevant event. With no further ado, I'll introduce our speakers. Geneive Abdo is a resident scholar at the Arabia Foundation, where she specializes in political Islam and Iranian geopolitics. Ms. Abdo spent 20 years as a Middle East correspondent for The Guardian, The Economist, and the International Herald Tribune, and was the first American journalist to be based in Iran since the 1979 revolution. Barbara Slavin is the director of the Future of Iran Initiative at the Atlantic Council and a former public policy scholar at the Woodrow Wilson International Center of Scholars. She's the author of Bitter Friends, Bosom Enemies, Iran, the U.S. from the Twisted Path to Confrontation, as well as Mullahs, Money, and Militias, how Iran exerts its influence in the Middle East. A career journalist who has visited Iran 9 times, she's a regular commentator on U.S. foreign policy in Iran. And Dr. Patrick Clawson is the Morningstar Senior Fellow and Director of Research at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, where he directs the Iran Security Initiative. Widely consulted as an analyst and media commentator, he has authored more than 150 articles about the Middle East and international economics, and is the author or editor of 18 books or studies on Iran. Geneive?
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you, Gil, for organizing this event. And I'm glad to see so many familiar faces, friends and colleagues for many years in this room, who I'm sure will ask a lot of difficult questions. So this is quite a challenge. I'm going to try to lay out sort of how I see the argument for why sanctions work and why sanctions are really the only policy option that the administration has at this point. Because of course the focus and the subject of what we're talking about today is sanctions. So I think that if you look at just sort of the realm of possibilities in dealing with Iran, and I think that we have to sort of, as a starting point, clarify what the objectives are. So as many people in the intelligence community have explained to me, the objective is to contain Iran. The more realists in the administration and in the government, political, not political appointees, but people and CIA experts who have been following these issues for many years understand that we have to be realistic, that we're not going to be able to combat, for example, Iran's proxies in the Middle East, that we're not going to confront directly Iran, that we're not going to invade Iran. I mean, the estimate of what it would take to invade Iran would be something to the tune of 400,000 ground troops. So obviously the discussions that go about in the media and to some degree in Washington are, sort of considering options that are never going to be realized. So I think if you consider, and there's a lot of talk about regime change, and I think that the more reasoned people within the Trump administration also say that regime change is not really a realistic option. So that leaves sanctions. And I think that if you look just as, going back to the proxies, if you look just at Iraq as an example, a country where the United States has been intimately involved since 2003, I was in Iraq recently in the summer, and I can tell you that I hadn't been in Baghdad for quite some time, even though I'd been in northern Iraq and Najaf several times in recent years. But it was quite astonishing to me the influence that Iran is having on the formation of the government as these negotiations continue to play out since the May 12th election. So there is direct Iranian deal-making, not only by the revolutionary commander Qasem Soleimani, but by other Iranian politicians who are basically making deals, hoping that they can unite the Shia into one huge bloc that will be beholden to Iran's interests. So these concerns, I think, that are articulated now that perhaps at the UN last week tend to be somewhat dismissed because of the personality of President Trump. When you sit down with other people in the administration, these concerns are quite real. And as Brian Hook has said only recently at the Hudson Institute, the other concern of the administration, in addition to Iran's proxies in Yemen, in Syria, in Iraq, is the ballistic missiles issue. So as he said at the Hudson Institute, he said it's the ballistic missiles program remains among the most significant challenges to broader non-proliferation efforts in the region and is an enduring threat to our allies and partners, including Israel. History tells us clearly that advancements in ballistic missile systems often go hand in hand with the development of nuclear weapons. Since ballistic missiles are the most likely way that Iran would deliver a nuclear warhead, this administration has been firm on its position that the nuclear issue must be addressed together with Iran's nuclear proliferation. So obviously, the main complaint of the administration, an issue that was debated in Washington for many years during the negotiations of the JCPOA, was the singular focus of the nuclear issue. And there was the counter argument that other issues should be included, ballistic missiles and also Iran's militarization in the Middle East. I argued, and I was a minority voice, that these other issues should have been included. But the Iranians and the Obama administration, well, the Iranians were deliberately never wanted other issues to be included. The Obama administration, of course, went along with this, and I will tell you why I say deliberate. Because the Iranians, and I was, for example, in a conference in Oslo as far back as 2014, and President Rouhani's chief policy advisor was at this conference, and he held a private session with experts and some American officials, and basically said, okay, we know that we are narrowing the focus to the nuclear issue in these negotiations, but if the deal is signed, shortly thereafter, we will discuss other issues. Other issues will be on the table. And the Obama administration believed this promise, which most people who I think have had a lot of dealings with the Iranians knew that this would never would never materialize. So now that we have sanctions, the question is, who is hurting and what are the effects? So are the Iraqis hurting? Most definitely. I experienced that when I was in Iraq, saw it on the ground in Iraq. Are the Iranians suffering? The Iranians of people? Of course. However, if the goal, which is one of the stated goals of the Trump administration, is to weaken the Iranian economy and therefore weaken the regime, these sanctions are working. And I'm going to present some statistics to you to show you how the sanctions are working. So, first of all, there has been a complete withdrawal of major companies that had either signed contracts with Iran or were in the process of signing contracts with Iran that have withdrawn. Peugeot, General Electric, Total, Boeing, which had a high-profile contract of $20 billion, withdrew. The U.S. recently convinced Volkswagen to cease its operations in Iran. So cutting off these kinds of contracts obviously deprives Iran, and these contracts involve car manufacturers, not only oil companies, really contractors across the spectrum. So obviously this is going to have an effect on the Iranian economy. It's going to have an effect on people's ability to buy goods. And of course, cutting off oil sales cripples the economy because it denies Iran hard currency reserves. And I'll just share some statistics with you. When oil prices were high from 2008 to 2014, Iran amassed $133 billion in foreign exchange reserves. So we're talking about, serious money that Iran uses, and there's not definitive evidence of this, but we have to assume, and again, intelligence sources have told me, that very little of the money from oil revenues actually go toward domestic purposes, that they're used for Iran's foreign interventions in the Middle East. How has it affected Iran's GDP? So shortly after the nuclear deal was signed, Iran's GDP rose from 3% to 12%. Now, the GDP is expected by various consulting firms to dip to 3.1%. The IMF had, and even another firm has predicted that by this is this year, 3% this year, by 2019, the GDP is expected to dip to 0.9% because of sanctions. The IMF had predicted before sanctions were imposed that the GDP would grow. Both the IMF and the World Bank had predicted that the GDP would grow to over 4% for 2018 and 2019. The real, of course, has plummeted. I looked it up today. The real now is 100,000 reals to $2. So if you ask the question, are sanctions working? I think the answer is obvious. The Europeans, of course, initiated last week an initiative that they believe could circumvent the sanctions by creating an SPV, and that basically, as it's been explained to me by economists, is basically circumventing the international banking system. So it's creating sort of a private firm for transactions when the Iranians export or buy goods or sell goods. I've been told again by former officials in the U.S. Treasury that this is not going to work. So we shall see, but that's sort of how the Europeans are dealing with the situation since their earlier claims of this summer, and Gil passed around an article I wrote for Bloomberg in which I sort of laid out why the initial European initiatives would not be effective, and we saw that they're not effective given all the firms that have withdrawn contracts from Iran. This is their latest proposal to try to help the Iranians deal with sanctions. So the last, I think, question that we were asked to discuss today is how is the Iranian population reacting and what does this mean for Iran and what is public opinion? So obviously there have been protests across Iran consistently really since December 2017. And the argument is often made that the protests to some degree are against sanctions and against the US government. But I want to share with you the findings of a poll that was conducted by Iran Poll. It's a firm that works with the University of Maryland, and I found the findings to be very interesting. Just as a caveat, having worked at 2 polling agencies during my career, I'm very dubious of polls. And David Pollack, who's with us today, has written a very brilliant monograph for WINEP a long time ago called Slippery Polls with some of his colleagues at WINEP, which I definitely would recommend that you read it because it's unfortunate to some degree that polling has become part of political science research, but David did a great job at helping us understand how even the polling agencies manipulate the results based upon their methodologies. And in a country like Iran, of course, the methodology is very suspect because, you know, if you phone people, which a lot of agencies do by phone from Istanbul, obviously the phones are bugged. So it's very hard to get legitimate results. But I'll just share with you the results on 3 questions. So one question is, which of the following do you think has the greatest negative impact on the Iranian economy? Foreign sanctions and pressure, domestic economic mismanagement and corruption? No answer. So 63.3% in January 2018 said domestic economic mismanagement and corruption, and only 32% said foreign sanctions and pressure. What's interesting, however, is despite the fact that we did hear chants and slogans, and we continue to, during the demonstrations, of the demonstrators saying, "Get out of Gaza, Iran for Iran." In the same poll, when asked that should the government spend less money in places like Syria and Iraq, 28 strongly disagreed. Only 21%, 0.5 agreed. Another question, Iran's current level of involvement in Iraq and Syria is not in Iran's national interest. 30% strongly disagreed, 31% strongly disagreed. The military should spend less money on developing missiles. 39.4% strongly disagreed. So the reason I'm sharing these results with you is I think that probably a significant part of the Iran, and this poll was conducted in the first quarter of 2018, probably a significant part of the Iranian population believes that Iran should be in Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and Lebanon. So this makes it even more challenging for the United States to try to create a policy, because we can sort of demonize the Revolutionary Guards, sanction the Revolutionary Guards, but obviously, if you believe some of the polls, and I happen to think that this poll is quite legitimate, there's obviously public support for Iran's regional policies. And the last point I will make is that we often talk about the fact that this wave of demonstrations, unlike 2009 and like 2010, or even when I was in Iran in 1999, where the demonstrations were very, very limited. When I was on the streets of Tehran then, there were a few thousand students, and that was basically the essence of the protest movement. Unlike then, and unlike those two very important waves of protest, the protests that we've seen in Iran are actually widespread. They cross social classes, and there is a lot of information online which I find very interesting. People have been mapping the demographics of who these demonstrators are. And even though the profiles are completely different, they come from different social classes, their economic, their earning power is different. Nonetheless, if you can refer to the handout we distributed, you can see that in December 2017, the protests quickly had a national and ripple effect. So, and this is something that's new in Iran to this extent. Generally, we saw an urban phenomenon, and this was true in 99, 2009, 2010, where most of the leadership, certainly, of this protest movement, of the Green Movement, and the precursor, which was the student movement, they were urban, educated Iranians. But you can see from this map I've handed out that we see day one, it started in Mashhad. Then day two, it spread to other areas, Isfahan, Hamadan. Then day three, it was in Bushehr, Shiraz, Sanjan. So this is not really a fragmented anomaly. It's a movement that obviously has gained momentum. It's a national movement. And even though the grievances are different, and the mapping online certainly has mapped out, people in Ahvaz, for example, are not demonstrating for the same reasons that people are in Isfahan. Yet, I think it's very significant, and as Washington continues to try to create a coherent foreign policy in Iran that is, aside from sanctions, that we take into consideration that this is a different protest movement. It's probably longer lasting than any protest movement we've seen since the revolution. And it's a way, even though, as I mentioned from the polling, there's differences in opinions among Iranians about other issues of concern to the United States, that the protest movement is definitely something that is significant, and the sanctions, as you saw, the Iranians are not blaming the United States for sanctions, they're blaming economic mismanagement, that if the goal is to weaken the Iranian regime, that if you're sitting in President Trump's shoes, it seems to be working. Thank you.
Geneive, thank you. Barbara?
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be sitting up here instead of down there with all of you, but good to see you. I agree with a lot of what Geneive said, but I also disagree with a fair amount. I'm not sure what the U.S. policy on Iran really is. I think there are a mixture of motives. We're seeing an economic war, certainly, and an information war. Last week at the UN was quite extraordinary. There were not just President Trump, but Secretary of State Pompeo, John Bolton, Brian Hook, 4 or 5 events and speeches that were all excoriating the Islamic Republic for a variety of sins. you know, again, I was trying to understand the reason for this. I think people in Iran well understand the problems in their own governments, so this was maybe to impress Israel, to impress Saudi Arabia and others that have also a very virulently anti-Iran policy now. I think the main reason was to justify the U.S. unilateral exit from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. I mean, this was an agreement that Iran is still complying with. We can talk about how long that will go on, but every other party to it is abiding by it. It was not a personal agreement, as Brian Hook said, but an agreement that has been codified by a UN Security Council resolution, and that should have the force of international law. If you watch President Trump when he chaired a brief meeting of the UN Security Council, every other member of the Security Council rose to defend the JCPOA, and Trump was alone in criticizing it. So the impression certainly was that the United States is isolated in political terms. Now, in economic terms, Geneive is absolutely right. The sanctions are already having quite a devastating effect on Iran. Their oil exports have gone down already by something like 1 million barrels a day, dropped 13% last month. China has reduced its purchases to about 500,000 barrels, and Japan is on its way to zero. Definitely these sanctions are having a very deleterious effect on Iran and on Iranian people. Where I would differ is the notion that this is somehow going to affect Iran's regional posture. And I think, Geneive, you said on the one hand it would, and on the one hand it wouldn't. Iran doesn't have to spend very much money on these proxy arrangements. A lot of this comes really cheap. Yes, it does provide, if you take the administration's figures, maybe $700 million a year to Hezbollah, which is its primary partner in the region, and its trainer, its shock troops. But that's not a very huge sum when you consider Iran's hard currency reserves. And Hezbollah also has other sources of income from the Shia diaspora and from various things like drug trafficking and whatnot. So the notion that somehow these sanctions are going to change Iran's regional posture, I think, is really not something that we're likely to see. Iran maintains its support for the Houthis. Certainly Iran, as Geneive said, is very involved in Iraq, as it has been since the United States overthrew Saddam Hussein. And it was instrumental in choosing all the governments that have come to power in Iraq since Saddam was overthrown. It remains, of course, a very close ally of Assad in Syria, and that war appears to be coming to a close, the only question being what's going to happen in Idlib, and whether that can be dealt with without massive bloodshed. But any sense that Iran is pulling back, I doubt. I was in a meeting with Javad Zarif, the Iranian foreign minister, on Saturday, and he had a comment which is in the story that you have in front of you, but I thought it was quite a good comment, so I'm going to mention it. He noted that the Israelis, or one of the questions was that the Israelis are always complaining that Iran surrounds it, and it's encircling it in the Middle East. And so Zarif feigned outrage. He said, "Have you seen that map with all the US bases around us?" and said, "Why are these Iranians putting their country in the middle of all these bases?" He went on to say, "We are in our region. We have not invaded any country. We have not sent troops anywhere. We were not asked. We have not bombed any country. We have not taken territory from any country. We are content with our size, our geography, our resources. We have no eye on anybody else's territory, resources, or people." So the notion that Iran is going to change this policy, I think, is certainly not borne out. In my article, I write about Iran's attitude toward Israel, which I think is, frankly, at the core of the problems that the United States has with Iran and has had with Iran since the revolution. I am sorry to report that Iran shows no sign of changing that policy toward Israel. At one point during the meeting, Zarif was asked to describe his sort of ideal region and ideal regional order, and he spoke of a peaceful region in which Saudi Arabia, other Arab countries, Iraq, Turkey, and Pakistan would all be respected and play a role. when we asked about Israel, he said, well, they're not in our region. So as long as Iran has that rejectionist attitude toward Israel, I don't think we're going to see any major change in U.S. policy toward Iran. Let me turn briefly to the question of whether the JCPOA is going to survive, because I think this is really, really crucial. The Trump administration has deprived Iran of most, if not all, the benefits that were promised by this agreement through both its own sanctions and the secondary sanctions, which are now being imposed and threatened. So why is Iran still in the deal? And here I think we've seen, I mean, you may find it somewhat hypocritical given Iran's policies on various issues, but Iran is very much wrapping itself in the UN Security Council and in international legitimacy and international law. Zarif and Hassan Rouhani both referred to the fact that Trump was violating a UN Security Council resolution. Zarif put it, you know, the first time in history that a permanent member of the UN Security Council not only violates a resolution of the Security Council, but punishes other members for not also violating that resolution. And so they are taking great umbrage. They are trying to put themselves on a moral high ground and a geopolitical high ground. It may be called comfort if you're not able to sell as much oil as you would like, but it's certainly something that they are luxuriating in. And I think after 40 years of basically being treated as a rogue state, we should not underestimate the importance of this for the Iranian government. They feel very much that the United States is the rogue now, and not Iran. I think one other point, and that is the Iranians are watching our midterm elections very closely. And even though a change in the control of, say, the House of Representatives is not going to result in the United States returning to the JCPOA, the Iranians made it very clear that if the Republican Party does poorly, that would also give them a psychological boost. They would feel that this is a rebuke of President Trump, and they are personalizing their difficulties with the United States around President Trump and his administration. There was a mention, there was some speculation, there always is before these UN meetings, will the Iranian president meet the American president? Well, I mean, all of us who follow this issue knew that they certainly weren't going to do it. I mean, Rouhani didn't even meet Obama when relations were at their best, arguably, in the last 40 years. But still, there was this speculation, and the Iranians said very clearly there was no way they would meet with Trump because they did not find him to be a reliable individual. They felt that even if he agreed to something one day, he could turn around and change his mind the next, and it would be hard for us to argue with them on that point. So why don't I leave it there and welcome your questions.
Thank you, Barbara. Patrick?
Thank you. So I also distributed something. This is just background information about how Iran's economy is done. Over the 40 years of the Islamic Republic, Iran's economy's performance has been mediocre, shall we say. And if you flip it over, you'll notice here, this chart is how Iran's economy has done, how the average monthly Iranian household budget has done over the last 20 years. And what you see is 10 years of steadily increasing household incomes, and then 10 years of declining household incomes. And it's against that background, well, you can see why the 2009 protests break out, and you can also see the foul mood that Iranians have today. They went through 10 years in which their things were doing well, and they thought that with Rouhani's election we'd be back on that same path, and they would resume the upward march. It hasn't happened. Why hasn't it happened? Well, on this one, I happen to agree with the Supreme Leader. I think that Ayatollah Khamenei is entirely correct that the basic problems facing Iran's economy are internal and not from the sanctions. And I think that one of the reasons that so many of the protesters and many of their slogans have been to reject the entire political class has been a great disappointment in the performance of the reformers, who were thought to be skilled technocrats and skilled at running things. And after all, much of their complaint against Ahmadinejad was that this guy's a buffoon, he doesn't know how to do things, we're competent, elect us, we'll know how to run things. Well, it's been very disappointing, just from a technocratic point of view, to look at how this team is done. About a little less than a year ago, the Rouhani government acknowledged that after being in office for 4 years, they now finally were able to say that government debt was 50% of GDP, not 20% as they'd been claiming for some time. And they had to acknowledge that, in fact, the government still did not have control over which institutions were issuing government debt, and that it continued to be the case that debt instruments were being issued with government guarantees, which the finance minister had no idea about. Now, you would think that the difference between 20% of GDP and 50% of GDP is a kind of a teeny little difference for government debt. But that's by no means the only area in which the government turns out to have done a truly miserable job. The foreign exchange mess that Iran has been in over the last 9 months has been building for a long time. And that this government thought that it could get away with issuing liquidity at 26% growth per annum for now 6 years, and it would have no consequences. Well, you know what? The exchange rate got way out of whack. Then when the government, when the free market rate started to collapse, the government had a whole series of inept moves. They tried to impose an 80,000 rate and were not able to sustain that for 3 weeks. The last couple of days, they're very proud that they've been able to drive the exchange rate on the free market down from 160,000 down to 110,000. Let's see how long they can sustain that. Good luck. And meanwhile, they've had an entirely accommodating monetary policy, which is only going to undercut the currency further. I mean, 2 days ago, the Statistical Center of Iran issued the figures for the price increases in the last month, ending September 22nd. And those figures show that in the last month, the inflation rate at an annualized basis was 88%. Well, never fear. The Central Bank of Iran keeps its own data on its own survey of consumer prices, and they issued theirs the next day, and they showed that the inflation rate in the month ending in September 22nd, if annualized, would be 103% per year. Well, you know, 88% per year inflation, you can't keep the exchange rate constant at that kind of inflation when your trading partners are having inflation that's running at 2 and 3% per year. Hello? And yet, that I feel confident that the government will continue to try to intervene in the exchange market and keep the exchange rate at an unsustainable level. Then there's the single worst problem, and the single biggest reason why the Iranian economy could really tank if there's a loss of confidence with these additional sanctions. And that is the mess that they've managed to make of the financial system. Now, that's in part a mess of the banks. It's been 4 years since the central bank ordered that all Iranian banks had to report their results under the Iranian version of the International Financial Reporting Standards, or IFRS, and the Iranian version is really watered down. 3 banks do so. And the bankers openly acknowledge, and so is the Accounting Association, that the reason that they don't report it is because they did. They'd have to acknowledge that they've had massive losses, and that they don't have the claimed 6% capital, a number which has been dropping and which is inadequate, and that the non-performing loans are much higher than the claimed 10%. So that's the formal banking system, which is seriously undercapitalized. And I mean, you read the IMF report 3 years ago and describes this as an urgent problem which really has to be solved, or there could be profound repercussions to the Iranian economy. And that's the regulated banking system. Then there's the unregulated banking system, which Iranian officials have, shall we say, an inconsistent attitude towards. Rouhani recently was blaming the unregulated financial institutions for the crash of the currency, which was particularly interesting since 3 months earlier he had insisted that they'd all been closed. And these unregulated financial institutions, which clearly have at least a quarter of the deposits of the regulated financial institutions, are run by the rich and powerful. In July, Shark newspaper ran a very interesting article based on what the prosecutor general had said the day before in court about one of them, probably the largest one, Salman al-Hajjaj. Salman al-Hajjaj had 3 million depositors and failed with $3 billion in debts. And this is an institution which operated for 14 years and was licensed to have one place where to collect charitable contributions, and it set up 500 branches across the country with 3 million depositors operating for 14 years, right? And the central bank had not closed it down. And this is not the only such institution, right? Oh, and by the way, it was taking the deposits and lending it to its friends at 3% interest rates at a time when the inflation rate was running between 10 and 20%, and paying its depositors 26%. Well, when you pay your depositors 26% and you lend at 3%, I wonder what happens, right? And furthermore, it was Shark then accompanied this article with a picture of the general director of this bank praying that previous Friday next to the prosecutor general of Tehran, right? Friday prayers. And the day after the article appears, that general manager of the bank proceeds to take a Shark newspaper to court to threaten them for telling lies, when all they had reported was what the prosecutor general had said in an open court. So to say that these institutions are beyond the touch of the central bank would be, to put it mildly. And when you get 3 million people lose $3 billion, they get upset. So it's not surprising that last November the first protests we saw were about, in fact, these unregulated financial institutions. And the Rouhani government has been very, very slow at addressing them. So, reforms like, for instance, introducing deposit insurance. Well, right now the deposit insurance system in Iran, which is now coming on 5 years old, covers only the banks which don't need it. It doesn't cover many of the regulated financial institutions, much less the unregulated ones. So in this environment, frankly, Iran's caught in a very difficult dilemma, which is to say that if it tightens monetary policy, then there's going to be a great many companies which will not be able to pay their workers because they won't be able to get loans. And many companies which are operating now at a loss because of the business downturn. Oh, and by the way, the Majlis Research Center 2 days ago said that Iran's already fallen into recession, and that the recession this year will be somewhere between 0.8 and 2.5%, and that next year it'll be 3.5%, the year after that 5.5%. That contrasts with the 4.2% growth, which was anticipated by both the IMF and the World Bank in their January reports. So that's the Majlis Research Center's estimate. So if Iran tightens monetary policy, they're going to be in a very difficult situation. But if they don't tighten monetary policy, we're going to see hyperinflation. And so this is a situation in which it's easy to see a loss of confidence in the financial system and to flee towards foreign exchange, which will only drain further the foreign exchange reserves, which the central bank right now is throwing into the wind in order to attempt to defend an exchange rate which is largely inappropriate. By the way, the depreciation of the currency was one of the few smart things that the Iranian government was doing, and so therefore that's one of the things they're stopping doing. If we take a look at the trade statistics for the first 6 months of the year, what they show is that in the first 6 months of the Iranian year, let's say ending September 22nd, no, first 5 months, I'm sorry, we had a drop in imports of $2.5 billion and an increase in the non-oil exports of $2.5 billion. So what we saw was that a substantial increase in all kinds of products being exported. I saw an article the other day about the more than doubling of Iran's agricultural exports to Afghanistan, which I find completely unsurprising when you're exporting tomatoes at 5 cents a pound and potatoes at 3 cents a pound. That's a pretty good rate, and you can find a big market. So the depreciation of the currency was having quite a positive impact, and so therefore, of course, the government's not going to continue it. So in this environment, I think that the pressures that the United States is putting upon Iran will have an impact. And more importantly, they put the United States government in a position of being able to claim credit for things which, in fact, would have happened anyway. As I've said many times in my career, if you can claim credit for the sun rising in the east, take it. And I think that's the situation the United States government is in with sanctions on Iran, which is to say the Iranian economy is going to be doing poorly, even if there weren't sanctions. And so therefore, by placing more sanctions on Iran, the U.S. government is going to be in a good position to claim that this shows our influence. Of course, the unfortunate day will come when there's an agreement and these people want to reverse it and say, oops, sorry, we can't do that. Right? But yeah, that's for another day.
Thank you, Patrick. I'm going to lead off with one question, and then I'll open it up to the floor. I think there's a perception by some, maybe many in the Trump administration, that the Iranian regime is already in dire straits, and that serious internal revolt and possibly regime change is a distinct possibility. How would you all evaluate the possibility of a real internal challenge to the regime on a pretty short horizon, say within the next year, if things continue as they are? And just go down the line here.
I think that that's fairly unrealistic, and even though, obviously we all agree that the economy is in a dire situation, the resilience of the system should never be underestimated. And the genius of the Islamic Republic is how the whole system is structured and how it's basically almost indestructible. Even if you take, for example, it's almost impossible to remove the supreme leader from power. If you're talking about a popular rebellion, even those I mentioned, and I showed you this map of national widespread protests about differing issues, but nonetheless nationwide, that's not enough to overthrow the regime, because the Revolutionary Guards, the besieged, are hugely powerful. The moment of the Green Movement in Tehran in July 2010, where millions of people were on the streets, I don't really foresee that happening anytime soon. I think that what could happen over time is that the movement, the societal movement will gain momentum, the economy will worsen, and there will have to be, as the United States says, changes in behavior. What that looks like, I don't know what that looks like, because I do think that there doesn't seem to be a relationship between the economic crisis and what they're spending in the Middle East. Probably because it doesn't seem to be on paper. However, the other argument is that without cash reserves, it does affect their military activities in the Middle East. So those are two arguments. I don't think that we have a definitive answer. You would think logically that it should affect their military activity, but even though there's an economic crisis, and they do spend a lot less, as Barbara mentioned, on their proxies than I think we've seen some of the figures from FDD and other sources, because reliable people in the U.S. government have told me that these figures are far too high. But I think if you're talking about regime change from bottom up, I don't see that happening anytime soon.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with Geneive. You have to realize that, some 10, 20 million Iranians out of a population of 80 million rely directly on the regime, are part of its security establishment, whether the Revolutionary Guards or the Basij, which is a kind of paramilitary group often used to put down demonstrations. While the government is extremely unpopular, and ever since I've been going there for the last 20 years, if people had a chance to vote tomorrow for another kind of government, I think most of them would certainly do that, and they would get rid of this, strange theocratic overlay that makes it difficult for the elected institutions to function. But people don't want to see chaos in the streets. They look at Syria, they look at Iraq. They certainly don't want externally engineered regime change. So I think, protests, yes, and we'll see more of them. The fact that the government essentially allows these protests to take place is a way to let people let off steam. We should recognize that. I mean, if, look at what Assad did. Assad began butchering people as soon as they came out in the streets, and the Iranian government is smart enough not to do that. This is a society which mobilizes people, 5-6 times a year for various reasons, and so they can't very well tell people that they can't go into the streets as long as they're not hurting public property. So I think a lot of unrest, a lot of discontent, but I would expect that the government will hang in there. The next interesting moment will come when the supreme leader passes from the scene. Will Ali Khamenei be replaced by one individual, by a council? Will he not be replaced at all? Will we see the constitution change the way it did in 1989 when Ayatollah Khomeini died and they elevated the presidency and eliminated the job of the prime minister? There are possibilities. I have to say, personally, one of the sad things for me is that I felt that the JCPOA, while it would not result in any dramatic change in Iranian internal or external policies, except on the nuclear question, I thought that an Iran that was more engaged with the world, that had more foreign businessmen coming in and out, more tourists, would be one that was more likely to evolve in a liberal direction, and that when the moment came for the supreme leader to go and for the system to be reconsidered, that there would be a better chance that Iran would continue to evolve in a more liberal direction. One of the fears that I have now is that the military will become stronger. In fact, Zarif was grumbling privately that the opinion polls show that Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Quds Force, is more popular now than Zarif and Rouhani. And Zarif and Rouhani had been very popular right after the nuclear deal was reached. So watch what you wish for. All the sanctions, all this pressure, the attacks that we've seen by ISIS-related groups, these strengthen the military and the hardline factions in Iran. They don't help the more reformist-minded people. Also sanctions. How will they evade sanctions, circumvent sanctions? I invite you on November 7th. We're going to have an event on that at the Atlantic Council. They have a variety of coping mechanisms, and they do not act in favor of transparency and reform. Let's just put it that way. They help those individuals and organizations that are most experienced at smuggling and deceit. So I'm worried that we have altered the trajectory of the Islamic Republic, but not in a good way. And I also do not see, Iran had a revolution and it didn't turn out very well. Nobody is really eager for the same kind of bloody event as occurred 40 years ago.
Geneive has one quick thing to add.
If I just may add one qualifier, the Iranians do execute and torture people who are protesters. The difference between their approach and Assad's is that they're much more strategic. So the Iranians are brilliant at identifying, they don't need to kill 40,000 people. They only need to arrest and have a disappearing act of those who are they believe are most powerful, who are the mobilizers. And they're brilliant at doing this. They did this during the Green Movement, which is how they shut it down. They don't need to behave like Assad. So I just wanted to, look at every human rights organization that's well documented Iran's human rights abuses, particularly when they identify people and arrest them. Thank you.
Yeah, I totally agree with that as well. One other point, for a real revolutionary movement to succeed in Iran, you need a leader, you need a vision for the future, you need an organizational structure. There is no single leader, partly because Iran is very good at taking people who have that kind of ability and putting them away and in prison for a long time. You may hear a lot of noise on social media, but a lot of that's coming from people in the diaspora, not from people inside Iran. There's constant bickering and fighting over, which way it would go. There are people in the Trump administration who've been very close to an organization called the Mujahideen Halq, which is detested in Iran for its past of supporting the Iraqis in the Iran-Iraq War, and is a kind of cult-like organization, very strange and absolutely not anybody's preferred choice compared to the Islamic Republic. And the organization, in 1978-79, the mosques were the organization. But Iranians have now become among the most secular people in the Middle East, and nobody goes to the mosque anymore, at least very few. So there is no network. When there are social media or apps like Telegram and so on, or WhatsApp that are useful in mobilizing people, the Iranian government shuts them down. So far they're ahead of the curve in terms of controlling dissent, and that's another reason why we're likely to have to continue to deal with this government for a while.
You asked about a real internal challenge to the regime. Well, there's one underway, and it's coming from the IRGC, which is at the very least is actively undermining confidence in the existing government and is probably vigorously contributing to the country's economic problems. And we see quite a lot of newspaper articles in which the IRGC figures contrast their success of their regional policy with the failures of the Rouhani government on the domestic front. And so we see articles about the need for a Reza Khan Hezbollahi, the need for a military president. The IRGC is, at least important elements in the IRGC are quite interested in making a challenge to this civilian-led government. So far, no indications Khamenei is interested in that. He seems to have suggested the IRGC back off, you don't have a solution. But I think that challenge is likely to accelerate in the aftermath of deteriorating economic circumstances. There is going to be a regime change in Iran. It's going to happen, without a doubt, when the supreme leader dies. We don't know what the character of the new regime will be, but there will be a regime change. The supreme leader has vigorously undercut anybody who could possibly be seen as a successor to him, and he's created a situation in which the only institution which will be powerful after his passing is going to be the Revolutionary Guard. And so that almost guarantees that the Revolutionary Guards will play a preeminent role in this new regime which will emerge. Now, it's a large organization. We don't have a good idea of who's going to come out on top. In many ways, the best we can hope for is that those who are interested in the venality and feathering their own nests come out on top, and not those interested in pursuing revolutionary ideology. Frankly, I think the chances of that happening are not great. The chance of popular revolution? Well, I would just suggest that I cannot think of a single occasion on which political scientists or outside analysts have been successful at predicting an outside revolution any place in the world. And given our complete failure to predict success, I would say that we are once again going to predict failure and probably be right, but we have no idea. I would just remind you that we have, in the Islamic Republic is in some ways really quite remarkable. They publish all kinds of things. And so we have these wonderful SAVAK documents about the clerical discussions in October '78 after the Black Friday episode. And the clerics, to a person, say that we failed, and it's going to be another generation before there's a revolution, and there's no possibility that we're going to come to power. And this is 3 months before they come to power.
Okay.
And that's what the clerics themselves felt.
Well, they didn't know the Shah had cancer.
Yeah, actually by that point the gay people did. When Reagan stood up there at the Berlin Wall, everybody thought he was nuts, right? We should have a little humility. My answer when I'm asked, is there going to be a revolution in Iran? I would say we have a miserable record of predicting revolutions. We have no idea when they're going to break out. We have few indicators why they break out. We do know that in Iran, that people are sick and tired of the regime. The ideology has much less of a grasp than it once did, and the country isn't doing so well. We also know that there, as my colleague said, there is no organized opposition leaders, and that people are afraid of the kind of chaos that's broken out in other countries around them. How that plays out, we have a miserable track record of saying how that's going to play out.
Thank you. All right, coffee's coming around. I'll open up for questions. 3 guidelines, please. Wait for the mic. State your name and affiliation. Please try to get to a question in a reasonably timely manner. Go ahead.
Hi, Kelly Torrance of the Weekly Standard. For those of us who want as many people as possible in the world to enjoy the freedoms that we here enjoy. And speaking as someone, I've talked to a number of people who have been tortured under this current regime, under Rouhani, who everyone says is moderate, but in fact executions have increased under him. Is there anything we in the West can do to help these freedom fighters? And I'm not talking about sending bombs in, but is there anything the West can do to help the freedom fighters of Iran?
Is that directed at me?
Okay.
Look, it's 100% guaranteed that Khamenei firmly believes that we are doing a great deal, and that a lot of the problems that he faces at home, a lot of the protests he faces at home, are because of our actions. So, when you take a look, for instance, that 21-minute film that the Iranian government has been showing about why dual nationals are a fundamental threat to the Iranian system, right? You begin to understand the depth of their paranoia. And they are firmly convinced that an episode like, Michelle Obama presenting the Academy Award to Argo shows the close coordination between Washington and Hollywood in this cultural invasion of Iran. We are probably in a situation where whatever it is that we can do, which I would first acknowledge is not much, the Iranian government will still blame us for whatever protests take place.
I do think, though, that I don't think that there's anything the outside world can do on a sort of large scale. But I do know from being in Iran when I was there as a correspondent that international pressure on specific cases works. It works beautifully. I mean, it's not an exaggeration to say that Robin Wright, when she worked at the Post, single-handedly released Halis Fattari from prison. I mean, so it's international pressure really works, and it works not only in Iran but in a lot of authoritarian states. And I think also despite everything we've said over the last hour or so, the Iranians are still concerned and despite their human rights record, which is abysmal, and as you mentioned, has gotten worse under President Rouhani, they still are concerned about their perception of what their international reputation is on the issue of human rights. So they are completely deluded, as Patrick says, but their perception of themselves and how they're perceived, they want to continue and to continue to perpetuate this kind of image. I mean, I don't know if it's still true because they don't allow me in Iran anymore, but in the old days when I used to get visas, the first materials they give anyone who's applying for a visa are magazines, books about how women have or extended equal rights in Iran. Okay? So that's how they perceive themselves, and they think that the outside world believes this. So it's complicated, but to answer your question, I think that there's nothing anybody can do about the larger scale human rights violations, but specific, intense pressure on specific cases does matter.
If I can add to that, Kelly. Yes, international pressure, specific cases. There was a woman who was sentenced to be stoned to death for adultery. International pressure campaign made the Iranians not do that. But there are other things that one can do as well. It's a pity that the United States left the UN Human Rights Council, because that council appoints a special rapporteur on Iran human rights, and the reports by that special rapporteur are very, very valuable in documenting the human rights abuses. The previous special rapporteur was a guy named Ahmed Shahid, mounted a huge campaign which has finally had some effect. Most of the people that Iran executes are executed for minor drug crimes, heavy overuse of capital punishment for drug crimes, and that number has come way down. It was like 1,000 people, and now it's down to 400, which is a substantial decrease. So if you pick your issues, or if you pick your individuals, and you make it multinational, you can have an impact on Iranian policy.
At the end.
Amitai Tzioni, George Washington. I just want to emphasize a point which was mentioned only for a moment, that even if there would be a revolution, there's absolutely no reason to believe that a regime will result will be a liberal democratic regime, give up on the nuclear program or on the other programs. First of all, if you look at all the other Arab Springs, how they ended up, sometimes we place one tyrant as another. But this notion that we're going to give a pro-Western, in fact, if you talk to reformers, they're nationalists. So, and they are never been opposed to the nuclear program. So this whole fantasy that 1 out of 100 we may get a revolution, then we live happy ever after, I think that door should be closed. But the question I have is a different one. If you for a moment put yourself in the shoes of South Korea and Japan, and you say to yourself, I will have to rely on the United States for my security. Let me see what's happened in the Middle East, to what degree these guys are reliable or not. And you look what's happening in Lebanon, and the United States not even playing. You just mentioned earlier, the United States increasingly surrendering in Iraq. It's not, Iran is playing a bigger role in Afghanistan. You're going to be kicked out of Afghanistan. The meeting about Syria, the United States wasn't even invited. It did not participate in the margin. In Yemen, the United States and Saudi Arabia cannot deal with a small amount of rebels with very little support from Iran. So you must go home and say, you know what? I'm really not sure I can rely on those guys, which means to add of the United States credibility as an international power. So my question is, would you agree to that assessment if you put yourself for a moment in the Japanese and South Korean shoes? Last, you mentioned 400,000 troops landing. It would be completely enough to boycott Iran. There's no, the nation of, we need land troops. If you remove a military option, for diplomacy suffers. If you talk to any Iranians, you do, the first thing they tell you, the United States has no stomach for another war in the Middle East. As long as you don't remove that, you cannot have productive diplomatic negotiations.
More than 70% of Iran's oil exports go through one pumping station.
And you wanted to attack them?
Just simply say Iran has many vulnerabilities. Iran has some strategic vulnerabilities.
I wonder how they would apply this.
Just level it, right?
Just look, I just simply say Iran has strategic vulnerabilities. I would say that on the question of the reliability of the United States as an ally in the region, I think that it's fair to say that the concerns for our traditional allies in the region, especially in Saudi Arabia and Israel, but also the United Arab Emirates, were much greater about the perception that the previous administration was not listening to them, and they are more satisfied that the current administration is, and that the current administration is making an effort to reverse what were perceived of as some of the policy mistakes of the previous administration. So the perception in the region is that this administration is taking a firmer stance on issues where they wanted to see the United States take a firmer stance, and therefore they are much happier with this administration than they were with the previous one.
Anyone else want to comment?
Yeah, I agree that the United States has no appetite for another war in the Middle East. If you look at the last 40 years, most of Iran's gains have come because of the mistakes of others. So going back to the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982, which gave us Hezbollah, looking at the U.S. invasion of Iraq, which overthrew Saddam and has given us Iranian influence there. You know, they're not infallible, but they've perfected a certain rather low-cost technique of nurturing local proxies, finding disaffected minorities, in some cases majorities, in Arab countries, and providing them with the necessary training and guidance to do the fighting for themselves. The United States does not have a good track record. Neither do the Gulf Arabs. We rent people, but they don't stay rented. And Iran is just much more successful in this way. It knows the region intimately. The United States will never know the region the way Iran knows its own region. I find all efforts at containment, dual containment, pushback, rollback, we've not ever really succeeded in any of these areas, and this is why the JCPOA was so important as a foundation for further discussions with Iran, which is not to say that they would have resulted in outcomes that we necessarily would have liked, but the channels were there. I think what most disturbs me now is that we have no channels to talk to Iran. Under the JCPOA, we had a joint commission that met every 3 months. That's gone. Pompeo didn't even try to see Zarif. That would have been the appropriate meeting at the UN security, the UN, not a meeting between the presidents. No effort was made. We have prisoners. We have dual nationals and American nationals who are jailed in Iran. As far as I know, there are no discussions going on now with the Iranian government about getting those people out. We have speeches. We have a 48-page glossy booklet that the State Department put out last week about Iran, the outlaw regime. We jump up and down and hold our breath till we're blue in the face, but we're not getting anywhere in terms of improving the situation either in the region or in Iran internally. And that would suggest to me that our policy is wrong and we should change it, but I don't think the chances for that happening under this administration are very big.
I just wanted to add a bit of insight into the proxies in Iraq. I mean, I personally do not think that on these kinds of issues, unless the United States has leverage, and in my view, the leverage was the nuclear deal, that ship has sailed. But if you look at the militias in Iraq, which by anyone's assessment, including the vice president of Iraq, the head of parliament, the Iraqi government cannot bring these militias under the control of either the government or the Iraqi armed services. I mean, it's special services. It's not going to happen. So and these aren't necessarily, yes, they're indigenous militias. I'm talking about the ones that developed after Sistani's fatwa in 2014. These are indigenous militias, but they quickly became under the control of the Revolutionary Guards. But I do think that we're missing, so as far as U.S. policy addressing the proxies, at least in Iraq, that's highly unlikely. But I do think that there is one vulnerability in Iraq, and that is one of the reasons that they're having such a difficult time forming a government is that large parts of society, and if you look at Basra, it's a Shia city, yet what happened to the Iranian consulate there? It went up in flames. So there is a resistance movement that is growing in Iraq that's new, that is against Iran's presence and penetration in the country. Not to mention, of course, the long-standing clerical objection. There are theological differences with Iran. There are historical differences with the Iranians. Ayatollah Sistani and the role that he's playing now is extremely important and should be noted because he is basically, in an off-record briefing just 2 weeks ago here in Washington, the high-level Iraqi officials said the Marja'i are running the state because they are stuck between militias, between Qasem Soleimani, between sort of lack of influence from the United States. So Sistani now has stepped in, which is why you see him issuing declarations such as anybody who's ever been in power cannot become the prime minister. And this is quite unprecedented. So my point is that it's important not to look at the proxies and place them in all one lump category. Because just like the Iranians, who have a very different strategies for dealing with proxies in every Arab state, the United States should do that as well. And even though we can't control the proxies, we can certainly empower those levers within the government and society that have already expressed their disdain for Iranian involvement in their country. And I think this is also why you see Sadr, although of course he can't be trusted, maneuvering back and forth from talking about a unity government to then seeming, but we don't know yet, to form a coalition with Hadi Amiri, who is of course an Iranian loyalist, because he's trying to maneuver and navigate what is public opinion in Iraq, and I was told when I was there that actually only 20% of eligible voters voted, not 40%, as the media has indicated, because people are so disillusioned with the previous governments. So you have him trying to navigate this very difficult road because of Iranian pressure and influence that is against what society actually wants. So I think that is a vulnerability. How the United States goes about this, I don't know, but when I was there, people were quite disappointed that the United States, the U.S. Embassy, now that's changed, McGurk has been there and so forth, but that the United States wasn't playing the role that some of the Iraqi leadership thought they should play in pressuring, using the United States leverage and pressure to push back against Iran. So anyway, I just wanted to sort of...
Can I add, actually, one thing the Saudis are doing better is that they are playing in Iraq now. The Saudi foreign minister at the Council on Foreign Relations last week, Adel Jubeir, mentioned this, and it is true that over the last year and a half, the Saudis are starting to throw some money around in Iraq, and I think it's perhaps better if it comes from them maybe than necessarily from the United States to try to draw Iraq back into the Arab fold.
Dr. Korsman?
I address this to Patrick and any of the 20 courtesans from CSIS. Address this to Patrick or any of the other panelists. You talked about what Iran is spending outside. The estimates of its defense budget consist of either none. Most of the think tanks and agencies aren't producing an estimate, or anywhere from 11 to 28 billion a year, which seems very, very low for those that do. And you have a massive arms race going on in the region, and what seems to be a fairly heavy Iranian investment outside the IRGC. And I wonder if you have any guesstimate as A, to what they're spending, and B, where all of these financial pressures are going to take you.
Well, the Rouhani government in the last budget proposal lifted the skirt a little bit and had a lot more information about spending on various different elements, on the law enforcement forces, on the Basij, on the regular army, and on the IRGC. But they were quick to acknowledge that in particular the IRGC has significant other sources of income. And the IRGC has always taken the attitude that it does not need to report to Parliament, much less the President, about what's the scale of other sources of income that it has available to it, and what it does with them. And I would say that it would certainly appear that a significant proportion of the Quds Force activities, for instance, are financed by those other sources of income. And so, but that's not the big bucks. It's never been apparent to me that what's reported in the budget for this expenditure for the Defense Industries Organization, and which is the umbrella organization for much of the procurement, how much of their cash flow goes through that budgetary account. In that certainly the norm for many other ministries in Iran is to raise from bank loans a great deal of their expenditures. So if you're going to build a road, many of the roads in Iran, the fancy highways are toll roads, and so you raise money from borrowing to the banks. And I would assume that the Defense Industry Organization has very easy access to the banking system for loans. And I would assume that a substantial portion of their resources are coming from those kinds of loans. So the numbers that are reported in the budget for this year, which at the time that it was adopted, if you add together the Army, the IRGC, and the law enforcement forces, and the Defense Industry Organization, we're talking in excess of $15 billion. I mean, I would suspect that the resources that they can get from other areas and bank loans and you know, the very substantial resources that are under the control of the SATAD, the pension fund for the Army and for the I mean, we're talking many billions of dollars, and billions of dollars under the control of the Supreme Leader's headquarters. I would assume that they can very substantially plus up that $15 billion. Very substantially plus that up.
Tony, for what it's worth, Javad Zarif was asked about this. He said that Iran spends $12 to $16 billion annually on its military. He noted that Saudi Arabia buys $67 billion worth of weapons in a year that they don't know how to use. He said the UAE spends $22 billion, which is ridiculous given the size of its population. So Iran is very proud of the fact that it claims not to spend a great deal on its military, but that it gets a bigger bang for its buck, so to speak.
I do think it's fair to say, though, Tony, that Iran has developed a military approach which is remarkably effective at getting value for money spent. As you have often pointed out, they lack such things as a modern air force, and so therefore in Syria they had to turn to the Russians and would have been in a very difficult situation, the Assad regime would have been, if the Russians hadn't provided those planes, and that no matter how many Shia militias the Iranians mobilized, I think Assad would have had great difficulties if it hadn't been for the intervention of those planes. And the Iranians are in no position to provide that kind of assistance.
If I may follow up just briefly, you cited a whole group of, I think, very real economic problems. Are any of those likely to affect their future spending capabilities?
Not sure. I mean, frankly, it would appear that much of the corruption from the from the unregulated financial institutions went into the personal pockets of the clerics and Revolutionary Guard officials concerned, rather than going into institutional spending. So I'm not sure that cleaning up that mess would necessarily reduce the resources that they got from there. And I'm quite confident that if there were to be a tighter monetary policy, that the resources available for defense industries organization would be the last to suffer.
No, I'd just like to underscore the point that I don't think it's really known how much the Revolutionary Guard's wealth is or how much they spend on military activity in the Middle East. But I think that, you know, to answer the question that we were posing earlier, is there a relationship between economic hardship at home and militarization in the Middle East? Probably the answer is no. So then the obvious question is then who is funding this? And I think that Patrick makes a good point. I mean, we've always known that the Revolutionary Guards, of course, they have investments all over the world. And the Obama administration's sanctioning of individual Revolutionary Guards under his administration, I mean, obviously that doesn't really matter. It's not as if any of them are taking trips to Florida or California, so, or, you know, anywhere that, or Europe for that matter. So I don't really, so I mean, I think that obviously we have to assume that their military spending in the Middle East comes from different sources. And even if you examine, for example, the funds that were unfrozen when the deal was signed, very little of that money actually was spent domestically. So, but nonetheless, it doesn't seem to matter. And I mean, I guess that's the interesting question. I mean, Patrick knows a lot more about the Iranian economy than I do, but the question is, with all of this economic hardship, why that deepens, why doesn't it matter?
Jeff, you had something?
Jeffrey Kemp here at the center. Patrick alluded to Syria, but I'd like to have a little more discussion on Syria, because it seems to me this is the one area that brings together Iran, Russia, the United States, Israel in a very dangerous sort of mix. As you know, until recently, the southern border between Syria and Israel on the Golan Heights was primarily occupied by ISIS and Free Syrian forces who have since left. And the great concern now in Israel is that those forces, that vacuum, will be filled possibly by Iranian forces. And here you have the ingredients for a continuation of a war that's been quiet and low-key, that's been ongoing for months, with Israel bombing sort of every 3 weeks or so, and the Iranians trying to retaliate. So could you say a little bit about how Syria works in the minds of the Iranians, given their investment there, given their commitment to Hezbollah, given the missiles they keep supplying, and the fact that Syria, if it's to be rebuilt, is going to cost billions and billions of dollars, which I don't think the Iranians have. So my question really is twofold. You know, what do you see the Iranian financial commitment to Syria in the longer term? And secondly, what do you think the probabilities are that there could be a military encounter between Israel and Iran in Syria over Hezbollah, over the missiles, that could then escalate and get out of hand?
I would say that on the whole, the national sentiment, which has grown so powerful in Iran, is, as we were hearing, there's a significant proportion of people who are pleased to see Iran have influence in Syria, but they don't want to spend money there. They want to make Iran great again, but not to spend any money on it. So I think there is a fair amount of resentment at how much resources Iran poured into a small place like Lebanon, and if Iran were to make anything beginning to be a comparable effort in Syria, I think it would be profoundly unpopular. But I don't see any indications that Iran's going to do that. I really don't. And as for your question about a confrontation between there, my impression is that the Israelis backed off a bit. And whereas I would have told you 6 months ago, I thought the chances of confrontation were quite high. I would say that the Israelis on the whole have thought about it and decided to back off, and that the Iranians are having the good taste to make sure that their people who are on the and near the Israeli border are wearing Hezbollah uniforms and not the other uniforms that they were wearing previously. There's some lovely YouTubes where you can see people taking off their changing uniforms. The big issue is going to be the question of those highly accurate missiles that Netanyahu was emphasizing in his Hunger speech, and that one is unclear, but the technology is on Iran's side, and they really have come up with some pretty nifty kits that, when fit onto these previously inaccurate missiles, I'm told, I'm no expert in these matters, but I'm told that it reduces the circular error probable by an order of magnitude. I don't know what's going to happen on that. I would say that Netanyahu's speech was a way of warning that Israel was seriously considering hitting targets in Lebanon.
Jeff, I think that the Iranians expect somebody else to pay them to rebuild Syria. I don't know where the money's going to come from, but they want the contracts for a lot of the rebuilding. And it would be Hatem Al-Anbia, the RevGuard construction company, that wants to rebuild Syria. The recent incident where the Russians lost a plane and all those people has really shaken everyone up in the region. And I read that Israeli-Russian relations are somewhat shaky now, that the Russians are blaming Israel, even though it was a Syrian defense system that shot down the plane. They say it was because the Israelis had been there, and I think the Israelis are taking a somewhat lower profile for a little while until the Russians calm down. Anything's possible, but the people in that part of the world understand very well what happens if a real war starts. And I don't think that Bibi wants it. Certainly Lebanon doesn't want it, the Syrians don't want it, and the Iranians don't want it. So a lot of messaging, but I don't think a major conflagration. We should remember that the U.S. is now committed to stay in Syria indefinitely, which is not what President Trump had promised, right? But he's been convinced to keep a small contingent of American forces there, and we still have the Kurds working with the United States despite Turkey's irritation at that. So, I think the real question is what happens to Idlib. How is that managed? Can we prevent a bloodbath? But seems pretty clear that Assad is going to consolidate power over most of the country, and that no one has an alternative to that.
Thanks very much. I'm Mike Kraft, a counterterrorism specialist. I have a question, first of all, on regime change. The MEK seems to have enamored a lot of people, including John Bolton. And my impression is the MEK doesn't have much support in Iran, but it's more of a diaspora thing. Like, maybe you gave your answer already with your fingers. But do you have any explanation of insight into why it seemed to be so, shall we say, popular among certain elements? And then on the Syria issue, you mentioned Geneva's polling. Did you see any reaction on the casualties that the Iranians suffered in their Syrian operations? Was there any backlash in that? And might that be an inhibiting factor? Because the way I see it, following up the other questions, is that the Iranian interest in Syria is partly as another deterrent against a possible Israeli strike, just as the supplying rockets and missiles to Hezbollah. That may be just part of it, spreading out their assets.
Can I take the MEK question?
Sure.
Yeah, there's a simple answer on the MEK. They pay a lot of money. And, John Bolton, before he was in the administration, he was taking $50,000 a pop to appear at MEK conventions. Rudy Giuliani is still on the take. The money comes largely from Saudi Arabia, which knows that Iran hates the MEK and so subsidizes it to annoy the Iranians. The MEK has no constituency in Iran. It's a cult, it's a weird group. You know very well it was on the terrorism list for good reasons. It killed 6 Americans in Iran during the 1970s, supported the revolution, supported the hostage taking, and had a falling out, with the regime when Masoud Rajavi wasn't allowed to run for president in 1980. So he fled to Paris, then he went to Iraq, fought on Saddam's side. He's disappeared. Now his wife/widow runs the thing and runs around in an extremely strange monochromatic hijab that is the source of much merriment in Iran, where no one would be caught dead wearing such an outfit. They have no constituency in Iran, but they've always been able to buy people, and not just Republicans. Howard Dean, a former governor of Pennsylvania, a variety of people that you would not expect to take their money have taken their money over the years, and I think it's really a shameful thing.
They have if I could just add, they have a great constituency in Europe. Don't ask me why, but
they pay students $50 to go, Austrian students and German and Polish students, $50 and a free ticket to Paris to go to their conventions. They don't have a constituency.
I was talking about among sort of EU governments. So for some time I ran a project on Iran with the German government, and it was a hard sell to try to explain to the Europeans the difference between the MEK and the Green Movement. I mean, this was in 2002. I ran this project from 2010 to 2014. And it was, they just didn't get it. I mean, they couldn't wrap their head around the fact that the Green Movement had nothing to do with the MEK, because to them, this is very simplistic, but I personally think the Europeans are really naive when it comes to Iran. And that's on all issues, whether it's human rights, the nuclear deal, whatever. They're just completely naive. And that naivete extends also to their understanding of opposition movements in Iran. The MEK supports these groups. They are always demonstrating in Brussels, have done so for many years. They have a great relationship with the European Parliament. The European Parliament supports them. I don't even know if they give them funding. I don't know about that, but they do the same thing with sort of European public figures. They pay them in tens of thousands of dollars, as Barbara mentioned, to speak at their rallies. So that's there's sort of this artificial opposition that has a great constituency in Europe.
One small historic correction, Barbara. One of the main reasons they were put on the terrorism list, and I was involved when I was at the State Department, was they were lobbing mortar shells at courthouses and civilian targets in Iran. And that we consider that an act of terrorism, even if we didn't like the regime. In Iran, rather. So that was one of the main elements.
Yeah, no, they continued attacks in Iran up until 2003, when the U.S. Invaded and put their camp in Iraq under protection, so to speak. That's when they stopped the terrorist attacks.
Regarding the question about the poll, I haven't seen that question, but I have a copy here. I can show it to you, and you can access it online to see if they address the question you're talking about.
I'm Jim Gilmore, Gilmore Global Group. First, I want to say that I was also offered a large fee to speak at the event.
You didn't.
And did not take the money, and did not speak. But, so I'm not on the terrorist list either right now. I don't guess. The question I have is a strategic one, which I've been listening. I'm trying to get an answer to here in my own mind. What is it that the Iranians are trying to do? What are they trying to achieve? And therefore the reciprocal would be, what are we trying to stop them from doing with all this activity that we're doing? I mean, it's clear to me that the Obama administration was trying to tilt that way, under the theory that if you cooperate and work with people, then you'll make them better. And the Trump administration has rejected that and has said, no, we're going to draw a hard line on these people. To stop them from doing what? What are they trying to do? I have taken for granted over the last number of years that the answer is obvious, that they're trying to control the northern tier all the way from the Afghan border to the Mediterranean Sea. And you can just see it all the way from Syria to Iraq to Hezbollah and all the rest of it. Is that what's going on? If that's the case, they're just being a good old-fashioned imperialist country, and we don't want them to be an imperialist country. Is that what's going on? If you're going to be an imperialist, you better have a good economy to back that up, and they don't. So what are they trying to do? They're trying to be an imperialist on the cheap?
Henry Kissinger's quip, which still remains quite accurate, is that the Islamic Republic has to decide, is it a country or is it a cause? And there are many people in that government who think it's a cause, and that want to spread an Islamic revolution, at the very least throughout the Middle East, if not further. So there certainly are hardcore ideologues for whom this is a matter of spreading an ideology. And there are also quite clearly proud nationalists for whom it's a matter of national influence. So we get, the Saudis have for years said openly and quietly that Iran can run things as it wants to at home. We don't care, but they interfere in our countries, and we do. And if they stop their interference abroad, then we would just despise them, but not do anything about it. Iran has prominent Iranian officials talk about how Iran now controls 4 Arab capitals, Baghdad, Damascus, Beirut, and Sana'a, which exaggeration may be, but it does demonstrate an ambition. So there is a revolutionary element that's got a cause. There's a nationalist element. One thing we can say with considerable confidence is Iran is not a status quo power.
not a status.
not a status quo power. That's interested in changing the status quo. And it thinks it knows a good way to do that. Doesn't require Iranian troops invading other countries, but that they have good ways of working through proxies and of subverting other governments.
Two things. This is not new. Remember, Iran was an empire once. It was the Shah who had designs on Bahrain. It was the Shah who took 3 islands in the Persian Gulf that the United Arab Emirates still claims. It was the Shah who sent the Imam Musa Sadr to Lebanon to raise the consciousness of the downtrodden Lebanese Shia back in the 1960s. So a lot of this is just a continuation with an Islamic veneer. The other thing is that it's opportunistic. As I mentioned, Iran is very good at profiting from the stupidity of others. And unfortunately, others in the region, whether it be Israel invading Lebanon in 1982, the U.S. invading Iraq in 2003, or Mohammed bin Salman invading Yemen in 2014, have made many geopolitical mistakes.
But I would like to add, though, even though I totally agree that it's the ideological elements of the regime that are driving this, there's also a military aspect of this. I mean, and if you look at, forget about Syria, Iraq, Yemen, take the example of Bahrain. Okay, so in the beginning of the uprisings, and I made many trips to Bahrain during the uprisings, there was almost no Iranian involvement in the uprising, even though the government of Bahrain and the Saudis were advancing this narrative that it was an Iranian-backed uprising. But what's happened over time is that a lot of some youth groups, one of which is called the February 14th Coalition, and another group called the Ashtar Brigades, which it's well documented that the Ashtar Brigades are now funded by Iran. And it is documented by some intelligence officials here in Washington that through the Ashtar Brigades, Iran is trying to create another Hezbollah in Bahrain. And if you're interested in reading about this in detail, one of our board members wrote an article that was just published last week in something called Just Security. And he's very knowledgeable. He served in the CIA. He documented in great detail the whole Ashtar Brigades association with Iran. So it is about ideology, but it's also about sort of military superiority as well, and it's hard to sort of separate the two. But I think that Bahrain is a very good example of not only Iranian opportunism, but a proactive campaign to fund these groups as they became in a more organic way through the years of the uprisings, when of course the situation has become more repressive, more sectarian, as they did take advantage of this domestic situation, but they also were very proactive in starting to fund some of the Bahraini groups. Some of them I've met in Lebanon, in Beirut, that are now funded by, I assume, Hezbollah. So
We have time for one last question.
Hi, thank you. Just getting in under the gun here. Henry Rome from Eurasia Group. Quick question, a comparison of Iran's economic, especially banking situation now compared to the previous round of sanctions. Are they better off, worse off, or about the same, ready to face what's coming in November?
Well, the banking system is in much worse shape, and that creates tremendous vulnerabilities. The world has moved on in lots of ways. Basel III, the now international tax compliance agreements that Iranian banks are completely behind on. So even if the Iranian banks were able to get in the good graces of FATF, which is not going to be easy to do, there's still going to be a tremendous resistance on the part of international banks to working with Iran's banks because of Basel III requirements and because of these tax requirements. And the Iranians, I mean, are just years behind in catching up on all that stuff. And so that puts them in a very difficult situation, even if there weren't the sanctions. And then you add on it, the United States government is clearly committed to vigorously enforcing these sanctions. I mean, Standard Chartered just announced yesterday that they're anticipating they're going to have a $1.5 billion additional fine, right? And so if you're sitting there in compliance office of any international bank, well, I mean, what's your advice going to be to the board about getting involved in Iran? Forget it, right? That add to that how delicate the state of the Iranian banks are. They have not been able to improve their capital base, and I think that every single solitary indicator of a country on the edge of a financial crisis is there for Iran. Every single one of them. Excuse me, except for one very important one, which is Iran does not have a significant external debt and does have some significant reserves. So if they can have access to those reserves, they'll be in pretty decent shape.
Well, thank you all for coming. Hope to see you at the center again soon.